Hey friend, thank you for joining me on episode 7 of the Live Well with Josie podcast. It has been a while, and I know, and I am so sorry it has taken me so long to get another episode out for you guys. Things have been so beautifully crazy around here with life changes and a new group course that I started called the Metabolic and Mineral Movement. And I'm just so excited for all the things that are going on in my life. But being an entrepreneur and running your business solely on your own takes up a lot of time and effort and energy. So when that happens, some things just get put on the back burner. And I didn't want my podcast to be one of those things, but it just had to happen for a moment's time. I try to put a lot of love into editing every single episode so that you can get the most out of every episode as well. So I'm happy to be back, and I'm excited for you to hear today's conversation. I'm really excited for today's guest. He is a wealth of knowledge in all things blood chemistry, functional health, and foundational health. He is a blood chemistry educator for practitioners and a functional nutritional therapy practitioner as well. He has worked with so many clients and practitioners on their own health journeys and has provided so much information to those who are struggling to get information from the conventional setting. Remember, if you enjoy today's episode, please leave a 5-star review and a comment if you feel called to do so. And without further ado, please welcome Michael Rutherford. Welcome to the Live Well with Josie podcast, a space for women like you to enter with an open mind and heart and leave feeling empowered to live your best life full of intention. Here, we learn together and we grow together. Enjoy today's episode. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to have you and talk all things blood chem and nutrition for women to thrive.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and get going.
First of all, everybody wants to know, who are you? What do you do? How did you get to this point in your career?
Yeah, well, I'm one of the lone males out here. In this space, it definitely seems to be mostly female dominated. So I tend to stick out, which is good when it happens.
Yeah.
But I have been practicing for about 8 years now. I started as a health coach through Primal Nutrition, which if you're into this whole, ancestral wellness space, it's Mark Sisson and Primal Kitchen products and Primal Blueprint, kind of a big umbrella. They've got a lot of different things going on, but they had made, back then it was actually called a primal health expert. We weren't actually coaches.
Oh.
We were just like learning about primal nutrition and health. And
Amazing.
they changed it into a coaching program just before I finished it. So then kind of, launched into that. And then always knowing that I wanted to go to the NT8, which is a lot cheaper and more affordable to start there. It's just like, I just need to get started. Yeah. So back then it was like $9.99 and it was like $1 down. So it was like $1 down and then $99 a month. I was like, I can do that.
Wow.
Versus
That's
the NTA,
amazing.
which was like 5,000 back then. So it's like,
Yeah.
this is more doable. My
Yeah.
kids were like just born. I have twin boys and they were like 5 or 6 months old at the time.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, I mean, I really came to all of this through just my own journey, as a lot of us have, is that I grew up with IBS since I was like a really little kid. And so at this point, I was 26, 27 years old and was like, this is just how my body is. This isn't, nothing works. I've tried all the different conventional things that they say of don't have dairy, don't, have more fiber, have less fiber, do this, do that. And none of it was really working. So I was like, okay, this is just how my body is. It's just going to suck. And it was funny because if you asked, it was definitely one of those, like silent illnesses things where from the outside, I looked totally healthy. I've always been an athlete. I've always been, into fitness and working out and trying to eat, good by, conventional standards and, what we're typically told. And so, if anyone ever asked me, like, yeah, I'm super healthy. Like, I don't have any other issues. I just have really difficult problems with my bowels. And it was really, for me, it was all over. Some people have just constipation. Some people have loose stools and then other people alternate. And for me, it was alternating. And so really dealt with that a lot. And what happened was I was having a conversation with my dad. And he had just taken on a challenge for himself of reading the 50 newest books in health and wellness and nutrition. And this was around 2014 or so. And he was just kind of blown away because this is when paleo was really starting to blow up. So a lot of those core foundational books that we kind of read about ancestral health and paleo and all of that were just coming out. Right. And functional medicine was just becoming an early thing. And so as far as just like being public about it, and so he was just like, hey, you've got to like read this stuff and check this out and see what they're saying, and just kind of having some easy conversations about it and what they were talking about. And I'm like, okay, this makes sense. Like, hey, let's eat food that we could have grown or raised ourselves 100 years ago.
Right.
Like, that just seems to just logically make sense, because that's what we had access to for 99.9% of human existence, regardless of how
Exactly.
long you think we've been here. The
Mm-hmm.
vast majority of our existence has been based off of this idea. Like, we could, if we couldn't find it or grow it or hunt it, you didn't have it. And
Right.
so it's like, okay, that makes sense. Like, let's just try that. And it wasn't to fix my digestion. It wasn't for any other reason. Of like, hey, I like eating healthy. And so I did it. And after about 4 to 6 weeks, I didn't have any issues with my digestion. And I was like,
Wow.
what just happened? Like, I've been told, like, the doctor's like, you just have IBS. There's nothing we can do about it, and
Right.
all these things. And so I'm like, this whole time, all I had to do was like change a few things from everything different of what you've told me for my entire life. I'm like, what? And so at that point, for me, and I've always been this way, if I learn something, it's like an all-in process. I want to uncover all the things, and we were just talking about that, all in, dive, get all the things. And
Mm-hmm.
really, I mean, I'm just like 7.5, 8 years into that process, and just continuously doing it. That's why I went
Wow.
to the Primal program. I went to the NTA. I've done probably 10 to 12 different side courses since then on different testing modalities. I've done probably 3 courses on blood chem, a couple on stool testing. I've done HTMA. I've done like 3 courses on mold. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
just never stopping. And, all the self-study and books and all those things.
Absolutely. That's usually how it goes in this field, is when we're having issues, especially chronic illnesses that we struggle with, we want to learn about how to support our bodies in a way that we're not even being told how to support our bodies, and then we go down the rabbit hole with all the
Yeah.
things, and then it ends up leading us somehow to the NTA, and then that's how we end up doing what we want to do. It's fantastic that the NTA allows us to take all that knowledge that we've learned previously and from them, and then apply it to other people in our own lives. So,
Yeah.
you also are a blood chem expert. You have your own course. So, tell us a little about that journey and how you chose to go down that route and decide to make your own course for blood chem and teaching practitioners on how to use that in their own practice.
Yeah. So it was actually just out of the NTA. It was literally like, I think it was leading up to like the final workshop. I was actually sending out probably 2 to 3 dozen emails to any holistic practitioner I could find in my area, which,
Mm.
like, hey, this is who I am. This is what I've been doing. This is the program I've gone through. This is what I'd love to be able to offer, or just kind of like meet and chat. Can we make connections? Is there opportunities? Like, any sort of connection that I could make, whether it was just like, hey, you don't do nutrition, but you'd want someone to refer to, or
Mhm.
actually working in your practice. And so I heard back from maybe 10 of them. I think I met with like 4 or 5 of them.
Mhm.
And then, some of them, they would respond back to like, hey, don't really have, any interest or whatever. I'm like, hey, thanks for responding at least.
Mhm.
Because most of them just didn't.
Right.
And then there was one who actually did hire me. And so I got to work in her practice. She was a functional medicine medical doctor. So she was an MD. She had practiced 14 years of family medicine and then had switched over to functional medicine through her own journey of just cognitive issues and just severe brain fog due to mold illness. And so she obviously got no help from her peers and colleagues until she found functional medicine. She was like, holy cow, like, I need to take this into my own practice. And so
Right.
she was building a practice here locally on cognitive decline and Alzheimer's and things like that.
Mhm.
And so got to work with her, which was really cool, because in that realm of medicine, when we're looking at cognitive decline and Alzheimer's, we're talking about something that's really advanced, that has really set in over decades and decades of time, and it's multifactorial. There's like 5 different major categories that go into that decline, and we kind of rate them on a scale, and we focus on kind of the top 3. But you've got to do a lot of lab testing to kind of look at that. It all comes from a guy named Dr. Dale Bredesen, who created his own program for cognitive decline. And he calls it like holes in the ceiling, holes in the roof. And if you have a leak, you can't just fix like 5 of them if there's 20 of them. You have to
Mhm.
patch all of those holes. And so it was really, you have to do all the testing to find all those holes. Otherwise, you're still going to be underwater.
Mm-hmm.
which meant these were like $3,000 to $3,500 worth of labs. Like, it was not cheap, and it was everything under the sun. It was extensive blood work, it was stool testing, hormone testing, hair testing, urine testing. Like, it was all the things, which was a little overwhelming,
Yeah.
but it was really cool to be able to look at. And the thing that we ran the most were the blood labs, because they were the most easy, because especially because she was an MD, it was the most
Right.
easy to get covered by insurance. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was a lot of what we relied on the most. And then we also shared the office space with another clinical nutritionist who actually guest teaches for IFM. He has his own mentoring program. And he used to actually work for Thorne, which is a professional grade supplement company. So
Mm-hmm.
he's done a whole bunch. He's just like an overall lab savant. Like, it's nuts to watch this guy like read labs. So at a really early point in my career, as I was able to learn from both of these people, which was just really cool. And again, we were using blood labs the most. And so
Mm-hmm.
at that point, I got really interested. And when I left there, I actually went to work for my dad's company, who works with long haul truck drivers, which is really odd for most people. Like, you were working with truck drivers on nutrition, like, they don't care. And most of them don't. But
Yeah.
just like anyone else, a large amount of them stopped caring because nothing was working for them.
Right.
They've tried all the things their doctor said and nothing was working. So they've been led to believe that it's just their genes and there's nothing they can do about it. And we
Mm-hmm.
now know that's not true. And so it took a lot of convincing over over time,
Yeah,
but
it's
we actually
still
had a
taking a lot of
yes,
convincing
we're
for
still getting,
everyone.
but we had a huge success. And my dad's company, he's got an audience of over 25,000 in a private group
Wow.
of these long haul truck drivers. And so we were working with them, and they
Mm-hmm.
suffer with chronic disease at about twice the rate as a typical American might, have. So diabetes,
Wow.
heart disease, autoimmune diseases,
Mm-hmm.
obesity, especially, like, they're dealing with those things at usually twice the rate. And their lifespan, the average male white career truck driver is 56 years. And
Wow.
if you take that out of the truck driver, you take that same demographic just as an all around American, it's 7 years. So they're
Mm.
like 20 years less. It's a huge difference.
That's a huge difference. Wow.
And their health they can actually lose the ability to drive based off of their health. They have to keep a medical card. And so they have to pass some basic screening. If they don't, then they have to get it more often and more often and more often, to the point they can actually lose it. So this is one of those few careers where they can actually lose their job based off of their health. So this is a
Yeah.
really big deal for them. And so we saw huge changes, which was just amazing to see some of the transformations there. But we had people a lot of them were diagnosed with different, chronic illnesses and metabolic diseases. And so they were routinely seeing a doctor at least once a year or so. So they had some basic labs, which are always those basic blood chem labs. And it was like, they would bring them to me and they'd be like, hey, what can I do with this? And I had a pretty basic handout guide, but nothing too intense. And I was like, there
Mm-hmm.
needs to be more of this. I know we can get more of this. And so that's where I started looking at these other courses. And, I've taken about 3 of them. And I had every course has their pros and cons.
Right.
The big ones that I saw is that, the 2 courses that I liked the most, this one had a ton of different markers, but was really basic into the information that it gave. It's like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
here's the range we suggest, outside of the reference range that the lab gives. And then here's some common reasons that you see in a nutritional practice for why it might be high and low. And
Mm-hmm.
this other one was just super deep dive detail into each individual marker, really like explaining what this marker is, what its physiology is, where it belongs in the body, where it comes from. But it was such a small amount of markers. And so
Mm-hmm.
I was like, man, what if there was a course that did both, that covered all of these extensive, awesome functional markers that our clients like to see, that we want to see, that are helpful, with this deep dive knowledge that was over in this one? And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I can create that. Like,
You
really
can
good at
create it.
research. I'm
Love
really good at
that.
research. I understand this. It's something that I've always been really good at, grasping a concept to the point of being able to teach it in a way that other people can understand, without,
Mm-hmm.
like, I can take a high level subject and explain it in a way that someone else can understand it easily.
That's so important. Side note, real quick. That's something that like I have to think about even when I'm talking on Instagram. When I started this platform, I was really talking like I was talking to other practitioners and teaching them. And then I'm like, I have to stop doing that. I'm not doing this for other practitioners. I'm doing this for the everyday woman who has, or men, whoever's following me, who has no idea of what I'm talking about. But like, I need 101 for dummies, everything. Like, me
Yeah.
personally, I need it to be very simplified. And I always tell people that are asking me how to kind of start really marketing yourself and everything. I'm like, everybody in America is from average, like fourth grade to seventh grade reading level. And so you have to keep that in mind. Even with practitioners who are more in the science space, the fact that you're able to take that really broad, scientific, in-depth information and make it into this really simplified, but still deep explanation of what is going on, I think is so important.
Yeah. And like you said, that is the number one issue I see with people on social media as practitioners is exactly like you said, they are creating material and using words and explaining things as if they're teaching to other practitioners. And it just goes over everyone's head. If you were a dental hygienist and I needed you to explain something about I don't know anything.
Yeah.
You can't talk to me as if you just read it out of a textbook or like you would with your
Right.
peers. Or if
Exactly.
you're an accountant, like most people, it's going to go over their heads. If you talk like an accountant, you have to make it simple. So to
Yep.
anything, it's not offensive to people. It's just we're not all experts in every single field. So if we're not
Exactly.
an expert in that field, we need it really simple.
Absolutely. Spark Notes it. Everybody needs a Spark Notes version of something. I've had a little bit of a dive into your course with buying your mini course, and the amount of information that you even had in the smaller condensed version of your big course is just phenomenal. So the fact that you provide that for practitioners is amazing. Tell me how you have seen a difference of also adding blood chem into your everyday practice.
Yeah. So blood chem, and this is something that even just in my marketing to people of like, hey, take my course, is that blood chem really should be the core foundational testing method that we use in clients, in patients, and whoever you're saying, however you term that, is that should be something that we're using the most. And one of the reasons for that, one, it's just the most scientifically backed. There's more research using blood markers than anything else. That the blood is studied more than any other, whether it's urine or hair or stool or anything else, is like that blood is what's being studied the most. And so it just has the most validity behind it. It's also just the most accessible. It's the fastest return on results. A stool test can take like 2 or 3 weeks sometimes. I'm going to get blood back in anywhere from 24 hours to maybe 5 or 6 days. And so it comes back a lot quicker, but it's also customizable. So, I always tell people if you order, the popular stool test, which is the GI map, and it has a ton of different markers on it, and you only want to see these 3 markers out of this whole list, you don't get to say, hey, what can I just get these 3 markers? They're like,
Right.
no, you have to get everything. And so you have to pay that same price all over again just to get just to check 3 markers out of, maybe 50. Whereas a blood chemistry, I might start with a really expansive panel that originally costed $300. And when I follow up, I'm only going to run $50 or $60 worth of labs because that's all I need to check. So, and people are like, oh, what does it cost? I'm like, well, it costs because they're used to HTMA or like a Dutch test or a GI map where it's like, this is what it costs. And it's like, well, it can cost anywhere from $25 up to infinity.
Yeah.
Because you can just get the whole test manual, right? It's like you
Right.
could just test until you're dry of blood. It's like we could get everything. So there isn't an end necessarily to that, which is why it's so effective. And it gives us this picture of like, hey, how is your body trying to keep its balance right now? How is that working?
I want to talk about some specifics when it comes to blood work. One of the biggest things that I know a lot of people go to the doctor and get tested is their iron. A lot of people are told that they're anemic and that they need to be supplementing with iron. And I know this is a huge topic. It's something that is just so complex, and it's amazing to have people like you who are more informed on the topic to explain to other people who would like to know more information on that. So, can you explain iron homeostasis and why conventional blood testing doesn't provide the optimal results when truly understanding our iron levels, and what optimal ranges are compared to what we would conventionally see?
This is a big one.
Big, but we've got time.
It is. Anemia, it really is a complex. Anemia itself, it is a really complex things with lots of nutrients and lots of potential things going on. Whereas even just iron, we have entire textbooks just on iron itself, which is just a fraction of anemia. Sometimes we have to understand that, and sometimes we use them synonymously, but they're not, is that iron deficiency and anemia are two separate things. We can be anemic and not be iron deficient, and vice versa. We can be iron deficient and not anemic. So these things, now the most common that we say is that iron deficient anemia. is that the iron deficiency caused the anemia.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is you have the iron, and one of the primary roles of iron in the body is to make hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a protein that goes into our red blood cells, and its primary job is to deliver oxygen to the body, which is a pretty important thing. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like all of our organs and tissues and everything, all our cells need that oxygen. And so the hemoglobin carries the oxygen to the cells, and then the cells actually give back carbon dioxide, and those red blood cells take that carbon dioxide to the lungs for us to breathe it out. And so it continues this exchange. And so being anemic means you essentially don't have enough oxygen delivery in your body, which is no fun. That's why something like fatigue would be a really common symptom of anemia, because you feel like essentially you're almost always out of breath. Like you literally don't have enough oxygen. So in that, there's a lot of nutrients that are involved. I mean, in just the healthy production of red blood cells and hemoglobin, you have vitamin A, you have copper, you have B6, you have zinc, you have iron, you have folate, you have B12. Like you've got all these nutrients that are involved in this process, but a little bit of vitamin C in there. It's really odd that vitamin C deficiency is linked with like all anemias for whatever reason. And so you have like all these different nutrients that are involved in this process. And it's like, there's a lot of potential there. And yet doctors are always jumping to, if you're anemic, it's iron. It's like, oh, you just need iron based off of the anemia alone. And sometimes they're not even necessarily looking at the iron markers. It's a real problem. It's like I said, we could be anemic and not have iron deficiency. Then when we look at iron, it's interesting because we've known about this for almost a century now. There are papers that I found going back to like the early 1900s that looked at copper and retinol's involvement in iron. And all of a sudden in the last like 2 years, it's become this really big conversation. So it's really cool that it's coming out. But I always like to remind people, like the ones who are like making it big right now didn't actually like discover this. Like, we've known this. They just refound the textbooks or papers or whatever, because we've known this for a long time.
Right.
But it's awesome that it is coming to the surface, because when we absorb iron, so we take an iron supplement, right? And that goes into our gut. Our gut absorbs it, and it even makes it into the bloodstream. It still isn't showing up on labs yet. So if you were to take an iron supplement, this is why a lot of people do take iron supplements and medications, and their lab values don't change, which is a really big hint of other things going on. Either they're not absorbing it, or they're absorbing it, but they don't make it what we call bioavailable. And specifically, that means it's in a way that the body can use it. And if it's bioavailable, then it can show up on the labs. And we need copper and vitamin A together to make this protein called ceruloplasmin. And that's a protein that acts on that iron and actually changes its form so that its binding proteins, the little carriers that like to pick it up and carry that iron around, can actually do so. If it doesn't get acted on by that ceruloplasmin, the proteins can't pick it up and carry it around. If the proteins can't pick it up and carry it around, it doesn't show up on the labs. And so what happens if we don't have that ceruloplasmin, because we're copper deficient or we're vitamin A deficient, is that iron is still in the blood and it's circulating around, and iron rusts, right? Like we all know, you have to be really careful. Let's say you took your cast iron and you just let it sit there in water and it just turns to rust, right? Well, that's what iron does. It's highly oxidative. And so if that's in your body and it's highly oxidative, that's really bad, right? It's free and it's in a highly oxidative state, because that free state is actually really reactive. We make it into a less reactive form, which is, slightly better, and then we can bind it and you make use of it. But that iron then goes and stores into your tissues and your glands and in your organs, and begins to oxidize and causes damage to those different areas. So it's a really poor thing. We don't want that happening. And really the only way to test you're free unbound to iron, the bad stuff, is to do a liver biopsy, which is not really recommended, to go in and essentially take a chunk of your liver to see how much is there, because a lot of that accumulates in the liver. And so that's a lot of what they're looking for.
That's a little extreme, but
yeah. So the easier way is, if you're anemic or you're iron deficient, and you're like, man, like I eat meat. Like I don't, if you're vegan, vegetarian, then it's a really good chance that you could just be truly iron deficient because you're just not getting enough of it. But if you're eating meat, which has more iron and has an iron that's more easily, digested and absorbed, you really shouldn't be anemic or iron deficient. And so if you're doing that and you're like, hey, what's going on? then you might want to try taking something really simple like liver capsules or eating beef liver, but most people don't want to do that. And so we take these liver capsules. They take the liver, they freeze dry it, they desiccate it, and they turn it into a powder and they put them in the capsules. You don't taste it. It's far easier and better, right? And then we're just getting on a daily basis. No, like no one wants to eat liver on a daily basis. I like liver and I'm still not going to eat it on a daily basis. So
Yeah.
I still take capsules. And the reason for that is liver is super, super rich in all of those nutrients that we discussed that it needs, but specifically, it's really high in the vitamin A and the copper. It's one of the highest sources we have per serving. And specifically, both those nutrients, but either one of them individually, even. And so now, all of a sudden, what can happen is if we are deficient in either one of those or both of those, and we have a lot of free iron, when we get we get that copper and vitamin A, it can go and make the ceruloplasmin, and then that ceruloplasmin goes and cleans up all of that free iron, and now it's available to the body.
I love that visual you just gave, that we need both of those in order to create that ceruloplasmin that will go and actually bind to and circulate the iron the way that it needs to. What do you say about, I know you said that even if you're vegan or vegetarian, that you might not be getting enough iron. A lot of our foods are fortified with iron nowadays. So what is your take on that?
Yeah. So again, that's a host of an issue. I mean, we have iron all over the place,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we have iron fortified in our foods. We have a lot of women don't know this, but birth control pills, those off days aren't just sugar pills. They actually
Mm-hmm.
have a ton of iron in them.
Mm-hmm.
And never mind that the synthetic estrogens that are in the birth control pills actually increase one of your binding proteins for iron. So it increases how much iron you bring into the body, even if you have enough iron. And so that now creates an iron overload issue, which is also a problem. We don't want too little, but we also don't want too much. And
Mm-hmm.
that can happen on that. But more importantly, is it's bringing those in, but you may not have all those nutrients. The more iron we bring in, the more copper and vitamin A we need. So if we're getting a bunch more iron, but not a bunch of copper and vitamin A, we
Mm-hmm.
deplete those nutrients, and now we can't bind that iron that got into our bloodstream. And so now again, we have this issue. It can be in other medications, when we're, prenatals. A big thing for me is like, yes, women should be on prenatals, but no, it shouldn't have iron. I'm really picky about the prenatals that they should be on. And if it has
Mm-hmm.
iron, they probably shouldn't take it because most don't. I mean, there are
Mm-hmm.
studies that look at iron supplementation in pregnant women, and it's not
Mm-hmm.
good.
Right.
Most of they have higher amounts their antioxidant storage goes down, their antioxidant levels go down because they got all that iron that created a lot of oxidation. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of things that get disturbed in that in not a good way when they're on the iron supplementation. Again, if you're, even if you're not eating meat, we can still get it other ways. Or if we are going to supplement with iron, making sure that we're getting vitamin A and copper with that.
Well, and that's one of the biggest things in conventional medicine too, is that a lot of women are kind of scared of vitamin A because of different things that they tell them, which is one thing we could unload there too. But it's important, like, obviously, we're not as conventional. We kind of lean the other way. Obviously, conventional medicine and Eastern medicine together can be very beneficial in certain ways, especially if you have like a severe issue, if you need to go to the emergency room, different things like that. But in nutrition, when you're being told technically to like stay away from something like vitamin A that is extremely beneficial but also needed, and then you're scared of it and you stay away from it and you don't have it, that's going to wreak havoc and cause issues that you don't even realize are being caused.
Yeah, it is. And it all comes back to it. Most of it comes back to like a singular study that looks at high amounts of vitamin A in pregnant women and risk of birth defects and things like that. But it's literally it's like 10,000 IU every single day long term, which you could that's a lot, first of
Hmm.
all, and it was synthetic. It wasn't food-based. We know that
Exactly.
when it is food-based, there's so much different in how that acts. It does come, if we're having liver, for example, it does come with the cofactors to make sure we're utilizing that vitamin. There's so much to
Exactly.
balance that. Like,
Bioavailable, again, the term
yeah, exactly.
bioavailability, your body is able to utilize it the way it needs to instead of just being synthetic and loading up on it and your body not being able to use it the way it needs
Yeah.
to.
I mean, if we look at ancestral cultures, especially if you go all the way back to hunter-gatherer, but not even all the way back to that, just small civilizations, is that
Mhm.
pregnant women had priority, the hunters and the pregnant women had priority over the organs. because those were
Mm-hmm.
the most nutrient dense. And they were getting tons of liver, which had tons of vitamin A. And they were
Mm-hmm.
prioritizing that for those women because just through understanding, like, hey, when we eat this, we feel better, we're healthier, there's better outcomes. Like, they didn't have the means and the science to understand what was actually in there. All they knew is that there was life in that thing. And when the pregnant women and the hunters, they needed that because those are the top. The hunters have to keep hunting to keep bringing
Mm-hmm.
food in. And
Right.
if we want our culture to continue on, women need to keep having babies and we need those to
Exactly.
be successful. And so we've known that for a long time.
I want to introduce you to a prenatal that is actually designed to optimally support your body and you and baby if and when that time comes. Needed is a mama-founded prenatal company that tailors their supplements for women before, during, and after pregnancy. Ryan and Julie, the creators of Needed, realized while on their own fertility journeys that 97% of pregnant women take a prenatal supplement, yet 95% are nutrient deficient. Needed formulates their products from the ground up based on the latest clinical research and experience with perinatal practitioners. They hand select every nutrient form that exists in nature and is clinically proven to be optimally absorbed. They also tailor dosing to what is needed for optimal perinatal health. Unlike many and most prenatal companies, Needed doesn't add any fillers, dyes, or unnecessary ingredients to their supplements, and they're dosed at optimal levels instead of bare minimum levels. I also appreciate that they provide an iron supplement separately and it is not included in their multivitamin, so you may tailor the dosage to your specific needs. They also offer additional CoQ10, choline, hydration support, and even a men's line because we often forget how important men's health is in conception as well. Needed has provided me with discount codes specifically for you to save some cash money on their trusted supplements. You can use the code LIVEWELL for 20% off of a one-time purchase order or of the first 3 months of their 1-month subscribe and save subscription option. Live Well 100 for $100 total off of the first 3 months of the complete plan, and Live Well Sample for $10 off of sample packs. I'm so grateful for Needed for providing you with this exclusive offer for you to even further nourish your body. Yeah, I love that you brought that up. It's something that I think about often, but I was just thinking about earlier today about how it's just fascinating that like we have so much information nowadays. And the sad and the bizarre thing about it is the information that we're learning and we're so fascinated by is just the way people used to live without thinking
Yep.
about it. It's so bizarre. We're like, oh my gosh, if you just ate the organs, if you just did this, if you just lived a simple life, you'd be happy and healthy. Wow, can you believe it? And back then people didn't even think about it. They're probably looking down on us right now being like, you guys are so weird. You just have to live simple lives and eat organs and just not spray pesticides and stuff all over your foods and you'll be happy. I was also thinking about just this vision of like God being like, I gave you what you needed and you guys did everything else except for just utilizing what I gave you.
Yeah. My wife and I have been like binging this show called Naked and Afraid lately. And so if you haven't watched it, basically what happens is they send these people out and they're literally like no clothing, no
Mhm.
shoes, no clothing, no nothing. And they send them into these just like they send them in the middle of the Amazon, they send them into like the middle of South Africa and all over the place. And they
Mhm.
have to live for like 21 days there. They get like a pot of water, or they get like a pot to boil water typically, and then like a knife and maybe one other thing. So they get like a couple of tools, and that's about it. It's super basic, and they have to go and survive. And what I've absolutely loved about this is that every one of them, when they do manage to like hunt an animal and kill it, if they do, they're always talking about like gotta eat the organs because like that has all of the things that they need. It's the most nutrient dense and all this. See, if you're put in this situation, like you know it. And these people, when they're
Exactly.
like this is what they do. They train on those things and to live in that.
Mhm.
They know they have to eat those organs because they're scarce on nutrition. It could be days before they get more. And so it's like I need to eat the thing that has the most nutrition.
Wow, that is fascinating. I actually have never watched it. That's so funny because I recorded a podcast episode earlier today and Naked and Afraid was brought up too.
It is a fun show to watch. I do
Yeah,
like it.
I've never seen it, but obviously in the space, shows like that, because I had expressed how I watch Survivor. But
Oh yeah,
it's
this
like,
is like on steroids.
yeah, I've heard. I know I need to watch it. I need to get on that train. But yeah, it's just, that's amazing that like when you watch shows like that, like I even watched Survivor, and they were, they chase around chickens and stuff. And obviously it's not as intense as the Naked and Afraid, but it's funny because I think about it and I'm just, there's so much activism with like not eating meat nowadays. I'm like, these people just on TV chasing around this chicken with a machete or a plank trying to kill this chicken to
Yep.
survive. But that's, I mean, that's just how the world was made, I believe. We believe. And the fact that like I take multi-organ supplements, or I'll take beef liver supplements, because like you said, I'm not great at stomaching the actual liver. I have 10 pounds of liver in my freezer right now.
Which is like one liver from a cow.
It's one liver from a cow, and it's just sitting. My mom and I were just discussing this yesterday, because they get a whole cow, and she's like, they asked me if I wanted some of the liver, and I said Josie would be so proud of me, so yes, I will. And she's like, I might just give it to you. And I'm like, Mom, I have 10 pounds in my freezer. Do
Don't
not give me
more.
more liver. Don't give me more. I'm still trying to like get up the courage to eat it raw. Like you said, there's the desiccated liver capsules, which is what we take often, and it provides you with that bioavailable nutrients that it's so bizarre when we talk about it, and like people will message and be like, why are you telling me to eat liver? My grandparents would talk about it, and I'm like, listen to your grandparents. They know what they're talking about. People used to know what they were doing without even having to think about it, and now we have to think about it so much. So if we just go back to our ancestral ways.
Yep. Yeah.
So when you are doing blood work with your clients, or if you're teaching about blood work, what type of blood work do you recommend specifically if somebody wants to get their iron checked?
Yeah, so if you go to a Western doc, typically they're just going to run your ferritin. So ferritin is the storage form of iron. And so basically the idea here and the reasoning behind this is that if your storage is sufficient, then you obviously have enough. I always use this explanation depending on the age of someone. They may or may not understand this, but it's like you wouldn't have a ton of money in your savings account if your checking account was empty. Today you can, because it takes all of 3 seconds to transfer the money. But 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was a couple days sometimes to make that transfer just from your savings account to your checking account. Like that was a big deal. Now I can be like, oh no, I only have $200 in my checking account and I need to make a $500 purchase, but I have 10,000 in my savings. So let me just transfer this real quick while I'm standing in line. And by the time the cashier runs my card, it would be fine. So that one, depending on the age group, that one can sometimes be like, well, I don't get that. That's how it used to be. And that's when I'm like, and I'm getting older now. But it's we're not going to put a ton into savings or investments or anything like that if we're barely able to pay the bills, right? Like we need to be able to pay the bills and have our comforts and things like that before we're even worried about putting anything away. And so your body is going to work the same way. It's not going to have a ton of storage. The problem with ferritin is that it can be affected by other things that has nothing to do with the amount of iron in your body. So we can have, there are studies looking at people who are iron deficient and actually have totally normal, or even, and moving upward, depending on the scale you use, moving upwards into the ferritin ranges. And so they said, I think the reference range on ferritin is like 15 is the low. Like it's super low. It's for women, it's 15 to 200. And then for men, I don't remember if it's still 15 at the bottom, but it actually goes all the way up to 400, which is just horrendous. No one should have it anywhere near that high. Male or female or whatever should not be that high. But it's, that cutoff is at 15. Yet they were showing that people who were iron deficient in inflammatory states could actually have ferritins of 70, 80, even 90. Wow. And so if you only use the ferritin value in this study, they showed that over 50% of people were actually iron deficient, but they were deemed normal off of their ferritin value. And that's what most doctors are running. And so they check that ferritin, like, oh, nope, you're fine. But it's elevated because of inflammation and infection in your body, not because of your iron status. So it's not reflective of that. Gotcha. So the first problem is doctors are only checking that. That's their go-to marker. And sometimes even in functional medicine, that's all they're checking. They just might use a different range. So that they look at that study and say, hey, your ferritin should be over 90. Because if your ferritin is over 90, then it's really safe to say that you are iron sufficient. Because even if you are inflamed, it won't get that high. which is not the way we should be looking at that paper. We shouldn't be looking at, like, hey, we're going to base our range off of really sick people.
Mm.
I want to base ranges for optimal health off of healthy people. So there is even in the functional medicine side, there's a real, there's not always agreement on these things because of how we're interpreting these different papers, which is always interesting, and not kind of stopping and looking at like, hey, what is this marker? It's why I teach the physiology behind these things and understand what it is, because there shouldn't really actually be a whole lot of ferritin in the blood because that's not where it belongs. It is an intracellular protein, meaning it belongs inside the cells. And when you're getting a serum value, so if you're ever looking at your blood labs and it says serum next to it, that means it's checking at what's in the fluid of the blood, not inside the cells. It's just kind of what's in all of that extra fluid space. And that's what we're measuring for ferritin, yet that ferritin belongs inside the cell. We don't measure that. So first, we shouldn't have a ton in there, so it shouldn't be super high into the hundreds and things like that. We should have, typically I tell people, if you were shooting for the most optimal kind of ideal, is probably 40 to 80, 40 to 90 is actually where we want it, not over that. If we're slightly over, that's okay, depending on what the rest of your labs look like. But it's also not ever relying on a single lab value. People come to me like, oh, I have this one, and they give me like one value. And they're like, what does this mean? What do I do? I'm like, I have no idea. Like,
Right.
I don't look at labs on a single value. I want to know what's the whole picture. So at the very baseline for iron, we would need that ferritin. We need what's called the TIBC, which is the total iron binding capacity. So it's measuring the total amount of binding proteins. You could also use just the transferrin, which is the primary one. It makes up about 80 to 85% of that TIBC score. So either one of those markers is fine. And then you also need your serum iron. That's like minimum that we would need. You could throw the iron saturation in there as well. But the absolute minimum we need is that serum iron, the TIBC, or transferrin. You don't really need both. Some people run both, and I don't really get it. It's kind of a waste of money because they're telling you the same thing. The iron saturation, the ferritin, like that's baseline. You need at least those. Ideally, you would run the CBC, which tells you your hemoglobin and red blood cell count and things like that. That's actually telling you if you're anemic or not. And that's like baseline. The problem is if we just run that and it shows that you have a lack of iron, as we talked about before, it could actually be a lack of copper or vitamin A. So it's like ideal world, we're getting our copper checked, we're getting our vitamin A level checked, and then we're getting that ceruloplasmin protein checked. We can check all three of those. And that then is going to give us a more complete picture of like, hey, which nutrient is actually the problem here? And so we need, it's again, we need these bigger pictures. Let's look at not a singular marker, but what are these other markers involved? And we could even, if we're looking at anemia, then it's like, well, I want to know the B6, I want to know the zinc, I want to know those other markers that we talked about, the folate and B12. Which one of these nutrients is causing a problem?
Right.
The nutrient.
Yeah, exactly. And when you go to a conventional doctor and you're asking for this, oftentimes they don't necessarily know specifically what you need to look at it from a functional standpoint.
Yeah.
And that's where like somebody like you can come along and really give them those optimal ranges where we have the conventional ranges that are bigger, and then we have the optimal ranges which are smaller. The larger ranges are what the average American is, which the average American is unhealthy. So when we look at those optimal ranges, we see what we actually should be as a healthy individual. And I think that's what is amazing about what you do, is that you look at those optimal ranges, but you don't just look at a singular marker. You look at the entire picture where you can piece together everything. And like I tell my clients too, like everything's so nuanced to where they are in their journey. And just because your markers come back this way doesn't mean like you're going to know the exact answer. You have to look at other things that are going on in their lifestyle as well. So if you're listening and you want to get your blood work done, then those are some great markers that you can start with. But obviously, it's recommended to work with a practitioner who works with blood chem, who can actually read that for you and give you a nuanced approach to what's going on in your body, inside, outside of the cell, in the blood, and really focus on the whole holistic spectrum of what is truly going on in the body. Do you see, with the women that you work with, but just in general, or with women, do you see a lot of anemia, or do you feel like it's more so something else that's going on? If a majority of clients come to you and say that they're anemic, that's what they've been told, does it really turn out that they're actually anemic, or is it usually something that's missing, like a cofactor that you've realized is one of the biggest culprits?
So yes and no. Really, again, we're looking at more the reference range that the doctors are using is more broad, right? And so if a doctor has said, hey, you're anemic, they're basing that off of the red blood cell, the RBC, and that hemoglobin, which will be
Mhm.
abbreviated HMG. And so they're using that. And if it's gotten to the point where the doctor's saying that,
Mhm.
it's well beyond the point that I would have been like, hey, you're heading in that direction.
Right.
Because like just, if we look at the range for women, and again, as you talked about how that reference range is determined, it can be different from lab to lab. There's no consensus of the country that says, oh, this marker range has to be this,
Mhm.
but rather they primarily, unless it's cholesterol because we want to give drugs, so that's a whole nother conversation, is that primarily what they do is, like you said, they take the whole population that comes into the labs. First of all, never mind that most of us are sick in this country, but especially those who are going to get labs. Most people don't get labs just to see what they are and stay up to date. It's when
Mhm.
they feel sick, they go and get that. And what they do is they take that whole collection and they get rid of the lowest 5% and the highest 5%. And the range that's left, that's what they use for the reference range, which is a terrible way, as you said, to develop what that reference range should be.
Mhm.
And ideally in functional medicine, I say ideally because not all functional medicine teaches this way. This is the way I teach, is that we look at research, at literature, which is what most people probably think that those reference ranges are based off of.
Mhm.
And we look at studies that actually look at culture, that groups of people that are within that reference range, and then they follow them for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and see what were their rates of death, of cancer, of cardiovascular issues, of diabetes, of hypertension, whatever it may be that they're following in that study, and say, okay, well, this group that was in this section had the best outcomes. They had the least amount of rates of any one of those things. So that's the optimal place. That's where I want to be. I want to be the group of people who had all, we didn't get any negative outcomes. Nothing bad happened. So it's
Right.
like, that's where I want to be. And that's how we develop those optimal ranges. So we look at just for hemoglobin, for example, the typical reference range for women is the bottom end is 11.7. Some labs will say 11.1. If you're lower than that, then they consider you anemic. Whereas I don't want you below 13 as a woman. So it's like, that's a big difference. I mean,
Mhm.
that's about an 8 to 9% difference there. Like that's a big chunk. And
Right.
so at 12.5, I'm going to say, hey, like, I'm not saying you're anemic when I can't diagnose you, and saying you're anemic would be diagnosing, but I'd be
Mhm.
like, hey, like, we're trending towards this pattern that can reflect anemia and having issues with this. Whereas the doctor would look at it and say, there's nothing wrong because you're above that reference range. So they got to the point where the doctor was like, hey, you're anemic. That they are like, they're using the diagnostic criteria there, but then there's no digging as to why, right? And so that's where it kind of falls apart, is like why it is. They're probably just giving iron. Maybe they looked at the iron values, and I don't even know what they'd say if the iron was normal, but you're anemic. Then who even knows what they say? They'd probably like, oh, I don't know what's going on.
Right.
But it's like, why is it? Do you have really heavy bleeding right during
Mhm.
your cycle? And so you have an excessive amount of blood loss. Well,
Mhm.
that's going to lose to less red blood cells because we're losing all of them, and you're
Mhm.
going to become iron deficient and deficient in a lot of those nutrients because your body has to replenish that at a higher rate, and it's not going to be able to keep up over time. There's tons of different forms of anemia. So it's like figuring out what that is based off of looking at all these different markers to figure out that pattern. Do we
Mhm.
have nutrient deficiencies causing low hemoglobin? Do we have nutrient deficiencies that are causing dysfunction in the form of the red blood cell? Do we have an infection happening? Do we have anemia of chronic disease in which inflammation and infection have actually shut down your iron transport? So you're iron deficient, but it's because you're not bringing iron in even though you need it. There's a lot of different things that can go on. And so often the doctors just don't look. They're just like, oh, you're anemic, here's some iron. And it's like really understanding what that is. And that's why I'm always hesitant. Every time I do a podcast and we talk about blood chem, is the number one question that everyone wants to know, or if it's on social media or whatever it is the question I get is, what lab should I run for XYZ? What lab
Mhm.
should I ask my doctor for, if I have a thyroid issue, or if I have anemia, or if I have this or that? And my answer is the answer that no one likes.
Mhm.
Is that it's I shouldn't need to give you a list, because if for you to give to your doctor, because if you're having to tell your doctor what labs to run, you're already in a loss,
Right.
because your doctor, if they're not running it, is because they're not going to know how to utilize it. They're
Right.
not going to know how to look at that and actually utilize them. You could have your doctor run the full thyroid panel and figure out, oh, here's the problem. And your doctor's going to look and be like, well, we're just going to still do this because that's what I know to do. even though that's not really the solution. And
Right.
so, and that's what I've seen happen time and time again, is they got those labs and they had to pay a bunch of money maybe for them, and they still didn't get any different information. And now they're even more frustrated.
The
And
amount of
so,
times that has happened to me, and
yeah,
luckily I've been able to, on my own, reverse my PCOS symptoms and live pretty well with that just through nutrition and my own research and going through the NTA. And I've pretty well managed my lupus also, which is really nice. But I go to my rheumatologist and I get my blood work done, and I get my blood work done. That's it. Like, they
yeah,
don't give me any information about it. They just do it. I will say, being an NTP, I really advocate for getting a doctor who listens to you and who will explain things to you, and going to like a functional medicine doctor or somebody, even if it's a conventional doctor. There are some conventional doctors who trust and believe in functional medicine and kind of practice on their own in that way, and will explain more things to you and talk to you through it and really listen to you. But I will say, even as an NTP, I don't have one of those for my rheumatologist because I can't find one. And that's the sad thing. I just can't find one around me. And that has been one of the most annoying slash frustrating things. One time I got 11 vials of blood work done in one sitting, and not one single word about what that meant.
that's a lot of
And
information to
it's a
not get
lot of
anything back.
exactly. And it's for me to be able to get my medicine and them to be able to hand it to me and say, okay, here you go, buy your medicine. And then they don't explain anything to me. Again, like you said, that's a lot of money and a lot of blood that I'm giving for them to not give me any information. And it has been very frustrating. And I will say, like, when I lived in Ohio, because I live in South Carolina now and I lived in Ohio, I had a rheumatologist who I first started out with. He was old school, so kind, always took so much time in the office with me. Like, you were always waiting forever to get in. But I think that the doctors worth going to oftentimes are the ones who it takes a while to get into them,
Mhm.
because they're sitting with you and talking to you and really getting to understand what's going on with you
Yeah.
and getting to understand you. And that's how this rheumatologist was when I first was diagnosed in 2011. He would take so much time and really understand all of his handwritten notes and his notebook he had on me, and just like really trying to get to know me. And then he retired on me and I cried. It was so sad.
Yeah.
And then I
Yeah.
I moved to South Carolina and I went through multiple rheumatologists, and I couldn't find one who just like gave me the time of day. They get you in, they get you out, and it's like, you know what? Like, this is why I do what I do, to advocate for myself and learn things for myself. Because when you don't have anybody who's helping you, or and you can't find anybody to do so, it is so frustrating. And so I have worked with clients where I relate to them
Mm.
not being able to get the answers you want or get the information you want, because it is hard to find somebody. There are some amazing doctors out there who will truly give you so much information, who will do as much for you as they can. And that's keyword, as they
Yeah.
can, because there's a lot that they cannot do, especially now. They have like 15 minutes they can see you in a doctor's office because of insurance and everything, which is just crazy. But there's a lot that they can't do. But some doctors will do everything that they can within the time period that they have. That's why it can be extremely beneficial to work with an FNTP or an NTP or somebody of the sort who you can find online. We're not able to be found very easily. And
Yeah.
so that's the thing, when once people find people like us and find somebody like you who can run this blood work and this no blood work that gives you optimal ranges, it's such a beautiful find and a rare find. So I really like that you put that out there. You don't recommend specific things because oftentimes you're not going to get what you want out of it anyways. You're just going to be paying for it, or insurance will pay for
And
it.
just be more frustrated.
And more frustrating. Do you find that, like, do you ever tell your clients like you can get the blood work ran and then bring it to you, or do you recommend, because of how you run the blood work, you want them to get it ran through you?
Yeah, I used to do that. It's like, hey, like, especially if they had good insurance and all of that. And even when they were like, oh, I've got a really a good doctor who they don't necessarily know how to help, but they're willing to work with me. Even
Mhm.
then, they screwed it up. Like, they would run the wrong test. I've even given them the order codes for the lab, and somehow they still there's things missing. And so I used to work with clients and give them a list, and now I'm just like, it's part of working with me. Like, we just need to
Right.
order this labs this way because it's just going to be better long term. I had too many mishaps, too many issues, and then labs are all over the place. It's a problem. And so yeah, it's really now it's just like, hey, whether it's finding me, I work, with clients, I work with clients within the US. I don't currently work out of the US,
Mhm.
which is I do have a lot of people on Instagram who are very upset about that, and I'm working on it. I'm trying
Mhm.
to find some good workarounds.
I know it's so
Um,
hard. I get clients too who want to work with me outside, and I'm just like, I just don't know how. Like
yeah,
the
there's
best
just
way
a
to
lot of
do it.
logistics around it.
So
Yeah.
many logistics.
And so, but I do work with anyone in the US. And so it's like either finding me or finding another practitioner who actually gets it, who's going to spend that time, whether it's a nutritionist, an RD, a doctor, a naturopath, a chiropractor. I don't care what their background is, where they originated from, if
Mhm.
they understand it. There are good RDs and there are terrible ones. There are good MDs and great ones. And that is going to fall under every licensure or non licensure, whether it's a certification or whatever. You're going to
Mhm.
find ones that truly get it. And sadly, in any of them, even in NTPs and in,
Mhm.
FDNs or whatever one popular program you find out there, the majority of them are mediocre. They
Mhm.
don't actually understand. I mean, honestly, in the programs themselves, there's a lot of really understanding how to identify a full-on root cause.
Mhm.
And so it's like they're great stepping stones and they're good at building the foundations. The NTA does a phenomenal job at getting the education of what are the foundations to
Mhm.
start helping people that no matter what your problem is, these things are going to help. You have to have your, a whole food diet. You have to have, some good sleep hygiene and all those different core things.
Mhm.
It's like there's so much more beyond that for so many people. And so finding someone who gets that, it's tough. And it's kind of the Wild West out there for the consumer side, the patient client side to identify who that really is. And so
Mhm.
often we forget as the consumers, as the patients, as the clients, that we're hiring them
Right.
to work for us,
Mhm.
right? No employee, no cook gets to tell the chef what to do.
Mhm.
Right, and if that's mixed up across the board because sadly a lot of doctors just have a real godlike complex,
Yep.
and they just think that they are God over you and what they say has to go, and that's not really the case. Like, they're working for you, but that also takes us advocating and standing back up for ourselves, like you said, and it's either doing that or taking this and be like, "You know what? This isn't working. I'm firing you, and
Mhm.
I'm going to go find a doctor who is willing to work with me." And sadly, most of the time we have to pay out of pocket because the insurance isn't willing to reimburse for a doctor to spend an hour with a single patient.
Mhm.
But the doctors realize that that's what it takes. And they have to pay their bills and they have to do all those things too. And so it does take cash pay and it's not always cheap. Some
Absolutely.
are definitely more expensive than others, and some have definitely, and it's a supply and demand. They're at a really high demand and they've got a huge wait list. And so they're going to charge more.
Mhm.
And so, but you can find great practitioners that don't have crazy prices.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important too for us as practitioners and anybody who's listening who is wanting to work with a potential practitioner. It's important for us as practitioners too to be able to meet with these potential clients and really assess what their needs are. And if we are not going to be able to give them specifically what they need, or if we know we can help them in some respect, but they might need some additional support later on after we've really worked with them on foundational health or whatever we do, then that's important for us to internalize too, that we're not going to be able to help everyone, one,
Yep.
but also sometimes we can assist people and support people in certain ways, but then we're going to have to outsource to other
Yeah.
practitioners as well afterwards. And I think that's what's amazing about like what we do too is like there's such a diverse community of FNTPs/NTPs who then end up going out and doing more
Yep.
trainings and different certifications. Just like you, we can go through you.
Yeah. So if you go through the full course, you are a functional blood chemistry
Mhm.
specialist.
And then also, like, I'm an HTMA professional. I do HTMA tests. I do GI map testing. So, there's so many different courses, so many different certifications, different things like that that you can get. But then there are other people who, even though you've gone through that course, you might not understand it in a sense that you can support a specific client. So some people who go to the exact same course are going to understand different parts of it or be more advanced in that area as well. So we kind of have to be humbled in that sense, where
Mhm.
we realize we're not going to be able to help everyone, again, one, but two, we have to be able to also vet out the clients who we're not going to be able to work with in the way that they need us to work with, but also have that referral program where we
Yeah.
can refer them to other practitioners as well. But we can refer you out to somebody that we know
Mhm.
is going to be able to help you in that way. So that's what I love about what we do, is just there's so many people who do so much and so many different things that there's always somebody you can refer to in this
Yes.
space. Okay, so say you're working with women who come to you have like severe metabolic issues or thyroid issues. You say that they have like hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, came to you already diagnosed, because again, like you said earlier, we do not diagnose, prescribe, cure, or treat anything. We support you in your journey of nutrition and health, but we are not medical doctors. We do not give medical advice. If somebody would come to you, they would have thyroid issues, metabolic issues. What would be your plan of action with like a thyroid panel that you would run through your practice with them?
Yeah. So for me, I always say, again, that the mishap that we give so often in the functional medicine alternative space is that, oh, it's the full thyroid panel, which to
Mhm.
most people means the TSH, the free hormones, the T4 and T3, the reverse T3, and then the TPO and T and thyroid globulin antibodies. And
Mhm.
that's a full complete thyroid panel. And I'm like, yeah, not really.
Mhm.
Because especially if you're not prescribing medication, those are actually less important. When you don't prescribe medication, those become less important because that's
Gotcha.
primarily what you use those for, is to prescribe medication and to
Gotcha.
manage those. What I
Mhm.
really want, I want to know all the other markers. I want to know those core markers, all the ones that you learned in the 101 course. Right?
Mhm.
Is like, I want to know what's on the metabolic panel. I want to know what's on that CBC. I want to know what's going
Mhm.
on with your iron and your blood sugar markers. These things that can begin to affect your thyroid, because the thyroid is a secondary thing.
Mhm.
It became dysfunctional because of something else. And
Mhm.
so I want to know what the something else is, because if I fix that, even if I never knew the thyroid numbers, if I fixed the why, it's
Mhm.
still going to resolve itself, even if I never knew exactly what it was.
Right,
And so it's
exactly.
really coming back. It's like, hey, that's where we need to look at. And, what labs specifically I run for each individual client will come down to what's their symptomology, what's their health history, what's their environmental history, and their timeline of when these things happened.
Right. That's important, again, with just the nuanced approach that oftentimes you'll have a client come to you or a client come to me and they'll ask me, "What should I get tested? What do I need to get tested?" And I'm like, have we checked your foundations? Have we
Yep.
focused on your foundations? And that's even like when I run a GI map on clients, I always start with an HTMA test. And I love that you've talked to the HTMA professionals about how blood chem and HTMA can be used together, which is
Yeah.
amazing. But I always start with an HTMA. The HTMA helps with your
Yep.
foundations. Hair tissue mineral analysis, you take a little sample of your hair, you send it into a lab, and they give you a lot of information about like your heavy metal detoxification and your minerals and the displacement of the minerals in your tissues, all the things. And it's pretty amazing. It gives you information about your metabolic type. So it helps us really focus on our foundations. And that's one of the biggest things that we learn in the NTA is always focus on the foundations
Yep.
first. And when you start running all these tests, it's so easy to
To
skip
get
all of
away from
those.
that.
Yeah,
Yep.
because you just want to chase the symptom instead of like really supporting those foundations and getting those back to where we need to be to optimally function. And like you said earlier, like oftentimes our symptoms will start to resolve themselves by doing some of the most simplest things when we are focusing on our foundations.
Yeah. So the tough love here is, don't try and fight with the doctor,
Mhm.
right? Is this what this we want? Is because we think that they should be able to help us. And the reality is, it's not even the individual doctor's fault. It really is the entire system of starting at the education of what is being taught, because
Right.
that's where they're learning. That's where they're learning those things. And they really get indoctrinated. Western medicine has essentially become a religion that they're indoctrinated to. They believe this system wholeheartedly,
Mhm.
and you're not going to change their mind.
Mhm.
Not 99% of the time, right? By yelling at them, arguing with them, fighting with, like, that doesn't happen in Christianity, doesn't happen in any other. That's not how we win people over,
Right.
right? And so at that point, if you're hitting a wall and you have a doctor, it's finding a new practitioner. find one. Social media has become a really cool way to find practitioners. And so using that tool to find someone who is going to work with you. A lot of my clients who come to me, they don't have diagnosable things because they are in this in between of they don't have a full-blown disease. Awesome, right? But they're not healthy either. And they're in this in between, and Western medicine isn't designed for the in between. It's designed for disease management. It's not even designed for reversing disease, but disease management. And so if you have a disease and you want to reverse it or get it actually under control or into remission, like Western medicine isn't going to help. And same for if you're in this in between of you feel like garbage, but the doctor says your labs are normal. If I look at them, I promise you they're not normal. And I've yet to have someone come to me where I'm like, oh, well, I don't know what to do because nothing is right. Like your body's perfect and all of your biochemistry looks exactly the way it should, even though you feel like garbage. I haven't had that happen yet. I've worked with a lot of people. So it's finding someone who can.
Yeah. And like you said, it's not your doctor's fault
No.
they can't provide you that information. I've talked to clients too who say, I got upset with my doctor. I yelled at my doctor. It really isn't their fault. Like they just weren't taught this stuff. There's so much functional information and then there's Western information. And so being able to be in this space that you learn the root cause, the functional approach to things is completely different than what the Western medicine doctors are learning. And that's when it can be a beautiful marriage, is when we have this integrative medicine. But if you don't feel like you're being supported by your doctor or a medical professional, again, it's probably not their fault. It's just the fact that they didn't learn it. If you're coming to me, I work on metabolic issues, but you want to know how to like detox from mold, go to Michael. Don't come to me. That's something like I need help on too. Like we can't help everybody in all the things. So even like your doctor can't help you in all the things. So give your doctors a little bit of a break. I've been there. I've been upset. I've been angry. I've felt the exact same way. But yeah, like you said, like they don't learn all the things either. And most of them are trying to do the best that they can do too. All right. And then my last question for you before we get to the fun part, which this has all been fun, right? What is your comment to people who automatically think, like we always hear we need to take vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc during the winter months or the sick months, right? So what's your thought process on that? And what do you have to say to everybody who automatically goes to the store to grab those supplements?
Yeah. So one, don't buy any supplements at the grocery store or Walgreens
Agreed.
or Costco or any of those places,
Mhm.
regardless of what supplements they are. But if we're going to specifically talk about, this combo of this three, um, and I used to push this and I used to say this and I've done this. And it's interesting. And I know that you do HTMA. So I'm sure you've seen loads of issues with calcium in anyone who has been doing this. But we see a lot, vitamin D specifically can really start when we're taking large amounts of it all the time, really start to disrupt other things. We have to remember that we start doing large doses of things in isolation, that's going to start affecting a lot of other things. Right? All of these nutrients act in synergy with each other. And when we take really large, unnatural doses of something, that's going to have unnatural consequences, essentially. And so, when we look at vitamin D, it's interesting because when we look at, the upper limit, basically, the safe upper limit is 2000. And the safe upper limit is essentially saying like, hey, you can take up to this, anything over this long-term could cause negative consequences. And it's interesting because I remember when I first got into this space, I was like, this is asinine. Like, this isn't going to help anyone. Like, that's like the minimum we need because all these things, because it's so often you see this functional medicine space that we need really large, high levels of vitamin D in our blood. And it's based off of people's symptomology. It's not actually based off of, is this best for someone? I always explain it. If I have daily migraines and I take Excedrin, it will make the migraines go away, but is it fixing the problem? And it's not, right? So just because, and this could be really tough for people to grasp sometimes. So just because it makes us feel better and it's natural doesn't mean it's okay.
Right.
and doesn't mean it's the best thing to do. When we look at studies that look at natural levels of vitamin D in people who get tons of sun exposure, we have studies looking at indigenous cultures in different parts of the world. We have studies looking at surfers in Hawaii who get tons of sunlight exposure. We look at healthy populations in Northern Europeans, and the average blood level for these people is between 30 and 45, which is vastly different than the functional medicine range that says 60 to 80 or 60 to 100. That like 60 is the minimum. And what happens is it often mutes the symptoms and does make them feel better, especially within autoimmune, because how it shifts the immune system. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Biologics and a lot of immunosuppressants will also do that. But again, they don't create long-term better outcomes. When we follow anything that suppresses the immune system, like immunosuppressants that are often used as a first step in autoimmune diseases, is that, yes, they do feel better, right? 100%, no arguing, they feel better. But the long-term repercussions of those is actually worse. And then a lot of times their autoimmune symptoms come back with a vengeance 5, 10, 15 years later. And we see that with a lot of those different ones. And we're actually seeing that now with vitamin D, because this functional medicine has been around long enough. And this recommendation to take 5,000, 10,000 IU of vitamin D a day has been around long enough that people have been doing it. And all of a sudden things are coming back. And now, and the theory behind this is essentially like intracellular stealth infections as a root issue behind a lot of the autoimmune diseases. And if we suppress the immune system, which our symptoms are the immune system working. So, right. It's like, and I was very thankful, growing up with a dad who fully believed that we shouldn't do cold medicine every time we have a sniffle, right? Because like that's your body expelling the things out of you. And if you shut that down, that virus, that bacteria just stays in you longer.
Right.
So we want to, if it gets to the point where it's disrupting your sleep and now you can't like even sleep, that's not good either. So it's like, that's kind of like, as a parent, that's what I do. Like I try and let my kids like fight it off, but if they can't sleep, then it's like, okay, let's try and give them a little bit because the sleep is important.
Exactly.
And so it is that balance of like, hey, it's not all or nothing either, but with vitamin D, we see some of those issues of suppressing immune systems so they feel better until they don't, because it didn't fix the problem. When we really look at the research, it's really interesting because the really like believed theory today is that vitamin D deficiency leads to chronic disease, and vitamin D deficiency leads to inflammation that creates chronic disease. But there's no pathology for that. The only support we have for that is doing studies in people when we compare people who had low vitamin D status to normal status, and then followed them for 10, 15, 20 years and watch their outcomes. And so we see that people who tested it and they were healthy, right? They were healthy, had low vitamin D, but this healthy part is the really important part. Instead, what we do have physiology and pathology to see that inflammation and infections and these chronic issues can lower the vitamin D levels. They don't actually like change your absorption or anything like that. What happens is they change the metabolism of that vitamin D. So we actually have two markers, and 99% of practitioners don't run the other one.
Yeah.
And we only run the one. And so we get this imbalance. And if we actually ran both, we would see that it wasn't a deficiency. Even I've seen vitamin D's, the 25 OHD, which is the one that everyone runs, at like 12 and 15. And their other one is actually up at like 80. And they should both be 1-to-1.
Wow.
But sometimes we can see them as high as like 5 and 6-to-1 in really problematic issues. And that just means there's plenty in the body. There's just an imbalance. If we equal out those metabolisms, they might be 35 of each.
Wow.
And so it's not that we have too little, it's that the metabolism is screwed up on how we're balancing those because of all these inflammatory proteins that begin to happen. And so when these people were healthy, it's not that they were healthy. They just weren't diseased yet. They probably still had some symptoms and some underlying things. And what we're seeing is that shift in that metabolism was one of the earliest things that happened. And so you might be healthy because you don't have a diagnosable disease, and that level is low, and over time it becomes a problem, and it leads to autoimmunity, it leads to bigger infections, it leads to all these other things, and that's the problem. The vitamin D wasn't the problem. We also see it because when you give ample vitamin D, like vitamin D supplementation, especially those over 30, has like no change and benefit. There's really no benefit to being over
Wow.
30.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the case, then why is it that we think that 60 and 70 and 80 is better? There's study after study that's just, there is not a difference in vitamin D levels basically over 30
Wow.
as far
So
as
you're
like
just
improving outcomes
loading up and it's not
and
doing
potentially
anything.
causing other issues.
Yeah.
And so, we start disrupting calcium, and we can disrupt our vitamin K and our vitamin A. And we already talked about vitamin A plenty. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's like we can start to see how we have all that negative impact. That's just one. We look at
Wow.
zinc. We take large amounts of zinc, and zinc antagonizes copper.
Mm-hmm.
Roundabout ways that we just found that we just looked at all these things, right, and why we might have these problems. And so
Right.
taking these things could end up creating anemia and all these other host of issues and starving our organs of oxygen because we don't have enough bioavailable iron because we depleted our copper and vitamin A through
Mm-hmm.
using these supplements.
Wow.
Vitamin C, and vitamin C, it's like, okay, well, what are we taking? Are we taking like, I would love for someone to take tons of camu powder, which is
Mm-hmm.
packed with vitamin C, actual whole food vitamin C
Right.
versus like singled out ascorbic acid, which is only the core of a vitamin C molecule, which has a lot of other things in it. And when
Mm-hmm.
we take that singular ascorbic acid, which is, the vast majority of vitamin C on the market, is that we start to deplete all of those other compounds because our body still has to add those things to that ascorbic acid for it to use it. And so we start depleting our bioflavonoids that we have stored up. And so when we take these things in large doses and isolate it over periods of time, we deplete and imbalance other things. And I've seen it, especially over what we have had for the last 2.5 years, that was a really common thing that you saw all over the place. Take all the vitamin D and the zinc and the vitamin C in large amounts. And now I'm getting people that are just so imbalanced and
Mm-hmm.
so many. There's magnesium. That was another one with vitamin D. You take vitamin D, all the vitamin D you take, your body's going to try and metabolize. If you
Mm-hmm.
take it, it'll try and metabolize it. And it has to do that in the liver first and then in the kidney second. And in both places, it requires magnesium.
Mm-hmm.
We're already struggling. Most of us are deficient in magnesium as it
Oh
is. And then we
gosh.
take large amounts of vitamin D without the magnesium. We deplete
Yep.
that even further. Now we have an imbalance of calcium and magnesium. So there's
Mm-hmm.
multiple things with all these things. Just from that one, we've created all these different things that happen because it's unnatural. Right.
Yeah.
And so we should be looking at that. It's like, hey, this just isn't even close to a natural amount. And really, if you are healthy, 2000 IU is all you should need max to fix an issue. That should be all you need to fix a true deficiency. You should really only need 800 to 100 or 800 to 1000 IU a day through sunlight and diet to actually really like just keep healthy levels. If we realize that healthy levels isn't 60, and it's
Mm-hmm.
probably closer to like 30 to 45, and then we
Mm-hmm.
are healthy. If you're getting that amount and it's still low, it's like, hey, we need to check that other marker. Do we have an imbalance in this metabolism? Do we have a magnesium deficiency? Do we have a glutathione deficiency? Do we not exercise? Do we not get outdoor exposure? Are we overweight? All of those things have been shown to be linked with lower vitamin D levels.
Yeah.
People who were sedentary, they had very little movement, they didn't exercise,
Yeah.
and had low vitamin D levels. When they began exercising, their vitamin D levels came up.
Wow.
When
And
people
a lot of gut
gut
dysfunction
issues, for
contributes to
sure.
that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If we're overweight, if we're obese and we lose weight, we don't do anything, we just lose weight, our vitamin D levels come up. So it's all
Exactly.
these other things. That magnesium, as we talked about, sometimes it gets stuck because the blood test that we run is after it gets metabolized in the liver.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're deficient in magnesium, we don't have enough magnesium in the liver, and we're taking that vitamin D and the levels aren't changing, it's because it's all that cholecalciferol, that D3 or the ergocalciferol is D2 is just stuck in the blood. It's not moving to the 25 OHD, which is what we measure on a test, because there's no
Wow.
magnesium there to do it. And so it's like we have to be checking all those other things before even, it's like that could be the problem. You just need magnesium. You don't need vitamin D, you just need magnesium.
Right. And that's one of the biggest things that has come out a lot recently. But like you said, these people who come out with all this information, it's been around. Like they've known this information, they just found the information recently. And so the magnesium is something that is coming out a lot more about that being a leading factor in a lot of the issues. A lot of it has to do with our magnesium, especially since our soils are so depleted. We don't get as much nutrients from our foods nowadays. And this is not to say like go out and supplement with all the magnesium, but that is something that is very common for me to recommend to clients in a specific
Yeah,
type of magnesium. There's different types of magnesium. I'm glad you touched on that because that's something that a lot of people don't realize.
exactly.
Yeah. So I know that you're a big fan of like beef liver, desiccated beef liver. Do you do the adrenal cocktail thing?
Yeah, so I actually use the adrenal cocktail powder from
Hmm.
Jigsaw. I really
Oh,
like
yep.
theirs because
Me
it
too.
is whole food based. They use
Hmm.
Redmond's real salt, so you're getting you're getting the trace minerals, you're getting the sodium. They use acerola cherry for the vitamin C, so you're
Hmm.
actually getting these whole food forms. They just make it super easy. And so it's just, hey, I don't have to get out 4 different ingredients in the blender every time. I just take it and I throw it in with my electrolytes. And
Hmm.
so it's like, hey, which I just finished today.
Love it.
So yeah, I do get those things in. And this time of year, like as we go into the cold and flu season, which that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But it's like,
It is.
hey, yeah, like let's increase that. We can get a little bit more, but you're getting it. I think it's like 400 milligrams in that of
Mhm.
the vitamin C from the acerola cherry powder. So it's really great there. I like organ complexes
Mhm.
for as like a baseline versus like liver. I use
Mhm.
liver with clients when we have specific needs
Yep.
for nutrients or certain issues. Otherwise, I much prefer the organ complexes, which usually have 4 to 5 different organs in
Yeah.
it because each organ has its priority of nutrients. And so if we're only focusing on liver, we're going to we're going to have great amounts of a handful of nutrients, but then we're going to be missing other things. So by getting
Totally.
those complexes, it's more of a multivitamin than liver.
Yeah, that's actually something that I've been starting to implement more is the multi-organ supplements instead of just the desiccated beef liver. I don't know why, but it was odd. I had myself on the desiccated beef liver and I had my husband on the multi-organ. I'm like, you need to take all these. And I'm like, well, why don't I need them? Like I'm like, what am I doing? But I do like to mix it up. I'll do beef liver a couple days and then I'll do
Yep.
the multi-organ a couple days. I like that. We can get more nutrients coming from the kidneys and other areas as
Yep.
well. So I really like that. And again, if you're wanting to work with a practitioner, in order to get a more bio-individual approach, work with somebody like Michael or myself who can
Yes.
really get you that bio-individual protocol that is specific for your needs. Again, we don't nurse or cure anything, but we can help support your body in the way that it needs to be supported with different testing also, like mineral testing and blood testing that can be extremely beneficial for that as well. So Michael, it has been a pleasure. I am really excited for this part. Are you ready for some rapid fire questions?
Yeah. Let's see. I'll see if I can keep my answers to rapid fire.
I did a podcast with it was the What the Health podcast. I love her. I listened back to it and I was just like mortified with how long my rapid fire answers were. But that is me. Like I explain everything in so much detail. It's like, what color is your nails? Oh, well, today I painted them pink because when I was 5 years old, like it is so bad. So if you go a little longer, it's totally fine. All right. So, what would be your superpower if you could choose a superpower?
Oh, that's a good question. I would like to fly. I like to travel and go other places, so we'll go with flying.
That would be fun. Have you taken any personality type tests?
I have. I've taken lots of them.
Do you know your Myers-Briggs?
It's been a long time and I can't remember it. And I actually usually flip whatever the last letter always flips between two of them.
Are you more of an introvert or an extrovert?
Introvert.
Me too. I'm INFP, so I'm like
I think
introvert,
that I think I switch between that and another one.
like INFJ, INFP, and
Yeah. I
INFJ,
think
maybe.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like it's like super borderline. And so it
Yeah.
swaps.
That's great. I flipped from like extrovert to introvert, but
I did after high school. I
yeah,
was always extroverted in high school. And then
me
when I've done it as an
too.
adult, I was always introverted.
Me
I got
too.
tired of
It's so
people.
weird. I know. And I actually heard, what's interesting, and I heard somebody speak on this, is that you could have always been an introvert, but you have like extroverted tendencies when you're with people. Like you are fueled by people when you're
And
with
just in
them.
school, you're always
And
around people. Yeah.
exactly. And that's why
True.
a lot of people see that in their high school and college years. I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. Okay, so a meal that you could eat for the rest of your life every day.
Chicken wings. That's
Chicken
easy.
wings. What kind of
Yeah.
sauce?
Buffalo, hands down.
Okay, that's a good answer. Buffalo is a good answer. Two things you'd take with you on a deserted island if you knew you had to be there and you could take two things.
Oh, this is super fun because we talked about Naked and Afraid, and that's essentially what happens. Oh
Exactly.
man, fire starter. See, I'm gonna put thought into this now. So fire starter for sure. Because if you don't have fire, like you're screwed.
Yeah.
And a pot of water, or like a pot. Like I feel like
Yeah.
it would be fire starter and pot because trying to make your own pot could be really difficult.
It could
But I
be
could
really
make my
difficult.
own weapons over time. and I could like make things to like traps and things like that to get animals and find food and things like that. So I feel like fire starter and pot. My wife does not agree, but I want to go on Naked and Afraid so bad.
You should. Oh my gosh.
They do like fan ones that are shorter. So it's like 14 days.
Really?
And like sometimes you get to go with like one of the experienced people who've done it before.
Oh my
But
gosh.
yeah.
You totally should. That would just be amazing. People would be like, what do you do? And you're like, oh, I do this. And your business would just be insane.
There's a really good thought about someone who has like an online business that you can work anywhere. Like find yourself. It's like why people go on Shark Tank. Like they don't ever go to make the deal. They just go to get in front of people.
Or The Bachelor. I think of that all the time. I'm like, you're not here for the right reasons. You just want your Instagram following to grow. Well, Michael, it was so awesome to have you on today. I know that this is going to really resonate with so many people, and the knowledge that you have to provide to others is just amazing. Can you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, easiest place to always find me is Instagram. So it's functional_blood_underscore chemistry. Because from there, then I have like the whole link tree that has all the links to get to other places, whether you're a practitioner looking for information or you're looking to work with me as a one-on-one client. Everything is there. I answer all my DMs and things like that as well. So either responding to comments or DMs or anything like that if you have questions.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. And I hope that we can do this again soon.
Yeah, always come back.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Live Well with Josie podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to leave a comment and review, as we would greatly appreciate it. Also, please remember that nothing discussed here today is to be used as medical advice to diagnose, cure disease, prescribe, or treat illness. These conversations are simply to be used as educational resources for living a life with intention. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Live Well with Josie, and my website, www.livewellwithjosie.com. See you next time, friend, and until then, stay intentional.